So it is great to see you this morning. It's especially great to see Mary Taylor and Jacob, as Jamie mentioned. So when I first started here, a long time ago now, they were a big part of what we were doing. And I'll never forget this. The first time we had our Connect groups, Mary Taylor was in my Connect group. And I found out later the elders felt like I needed a chaperone, and she got the job. So she was a part of that for years and years. And then Jacob was also here. It was a big part of what we were trying to do. All those years ago, he did all kinds of things around here. He painted some walls for us and played in the worship band. And we did have to go back and repaint those walls several times, but he was always willing to help. So we're grateful that they're here. And if you don't know them, I hope that you'll at least get to know them maybe after the service. Now, if you have your Bible, I want you to turn to Luke chapter 5. Luke chapter 5. One of the biggest stories in the retail world over the last few months, last year, has been the demise of the retail giant Bed Bath & Beyond. I've got a picture I want to show you. It was announced back in April of this year that after a decade of decline, and after closing nearly 360 of their stores, they were declaring bankruptcy and were going to close the other 500 locations by July 30th of this year, which they did just a few weeks ago. As soon as it was announced, almost every major newspaper and magazine started writing these articles analyzing how this happened. How did this once great company suddenly collapse? And one of the things that all the articles mentioned was an inordinate amount of leadership dysfunction within the company. The CFO committed suicide. The board of directors fired the CEO. The old CEO then sued the board of directors and the incoming CEO. And that was all before the COVID pandemic with inflation and supply chain issues, which drove the prices up, which drove sales down. At the same time, they also entered into an exclusive partnership with a new supplier that also turned out to be a disaster and turned into a price tag of $11.8 billion. As challenging as those things were, though, everybody agreed those are not the things that drove them out of business. Those are things that, if you're in business long enough, everybody eventually has to deal with. Instead, experts agree that what ultimately drove Bed Bath & Beyond out of business was a fatal combination of a divided focus and a changing culture. Back in the 1990s, soon after they went public, the leaders of the company went on a buying spree in which they acquired several smaller companies that later became part of this broader company known as Bed Bath & Beyond. So if you've ever been to a Bye Bye Baby or a Christmas tree shop, or there were several other examples of smaller companies that they purchased. At the same time that they were doing all of that and expanding into these new markets, they were slow to recognize that online shopping was not just the way of the future, but overnight had become the way of the present. So one respected business analyst noted that the story of Bed Bath & Beyond followed kind of the same pattern of every other retail giant that we've seen collapse in recent years. It's a story of decline, followed by downsizing, followed by bankruptcy, followed by discounts to get rid of the remaining merchandise, and eventually the shutting of the doors. Now, for some of you, that may be an interesting story that you vaguely remember reading something about in the newspaper. For others of you, depending on your shopping habits, that you may view that more as a personal tragedy because you really enjoyed going to Bed Bath & Beyond. But just for a few minutes this morning, I want you to think about the two things that caused their collapse: a divided focus and a changing culture. This morning, if you have your Bible open to Luke 5, we're finishing up this series that we've been in. We've looked at four scenes that all unfolded right at the beginning of what we call Jesus' public ministry. And when you put those scenes together, they form an origin story that shows us what the church is supposed to look like and how it's been designed to function. And as it turns out, the same two things that led to the death of Bed Bath & Beyond are the same two challenges that have already killed and continue to threaten lots and lots of churches just like ours. Just like the board of directors at Bed Bath & Beyond learned that the retail business in the 2020s is nothing like the retail business in the 1990s, there are churches, just like ours, that are slowly coming to the painful realization that ministry in the 2020s doesn't look much like it did in the 1990s. And it bears almost no resemblance to the way it looked in the 1950s. And while a lot of churches have been distracted, arguing over secondary issues, the world around us has now changed to the point that it's barely recognizable. And some of you have lived through that change, and you know that the world that you find yourself living in today, in August of 2023, doesn't look anything like the world you remember, and in some ways, the world that you would prefer. So what do we do? So there are several different options, and if you look around almost any community, you'll find different churches that have chosen one of two options. So one option that a lot of churches take is in their attempts to be accepted by the culture, they've pretty much surrendered to the culture. So they've kind of changed what they believe and who they are in order to connect with people that don't believe like them. Then there are other churches who are content to go on pretending that nothing has really changed. And so rather than adapting to a changing environment, they've kind of doubled down on what used to work. So they remember what it was like in the 90s, they remember what it was like in the 50s, and they've kind of doubled down on that. And so they spend most of their time answering questions that nobody is asking and holding services that fewer and fewer people attend with each passing year. And with both of those options, what you'll find is that unless something dramatic changes, the story of those churches will eventually look like the story of Bed Bath & Beyond. It'll be decline, followed by downsizing, and eventually the shutting of the doors. And that leaves us with a question. Is there a better way? Is there a way forward that doesn't involve surrendering to the culture, or the equally dangerous option of pretending that nothing has changed when in reality everything has changed? I think there is, but in order to find it, we have to go back to the beginning. So if you're tracking with us today, here's the big idea that we want to focus on. It's been one of the hallmarks of our movement, and here it is. Moving forward often requires looking backward. Now, as soon as you hear that, it sounds kind of paradoxical. It sounds like it fits with some of those things we talked about last week. And you read through the New Testament, you run into all these paradoxical statements that on the surface don't seem like they make sense. So there's this place where Jesus says, the first will be last and the last will be first. You're like, what? The Apostle Paul says it's when we're weak that we're strong. And then he goes on and he calls us saints, even though we know we're sinners. And none of those things seem to fit together. And this is kind of a similar idea. You think that doesn't really fit together. How do you move forward how do you move forward by looking backward? And most of the time in our culture, we talk about never looking backward, right? So you'll hear these phrases, never look back, don't turn around. Not too long ago, you could walk into Bed Bath & Beyond and they have this statement, always look at life through the windshield, never through the rearview mirror, and it was beautifully embroidered on some towel. And you think, that sounds like good advice when we kind of know what they're talking about. But then you come to certain moments when you realize you can't really move forward without looking back. And please don't misunderstand. I'm not talking about what Wayne Smith used to call the crawdad mentality. You ever heard that? You're backing into the future, looking forward to the past. It's not that. But it is looking back at the beginning to see what you need to do in the present. So it's not about trying to recreate the past. It's about trying to reconnect with your future, your history, your roots, to see how you can be most effective in the present. There's this great story that comes at the end of Luke chapter 5 that perfectly captures the way the church has been designed to work. And what's so helpful about this story in particular is that the three values it highlights are timeless. Doesn't matter if you're talking about the first century or the 21st century, they still work. And that brings us to verse 27 here in Luke chapter 5. Here's what it says. After this, Jesus went out and he saw a tax collector by the name of Levi sitting at his tax booth. Now, let me just stop there for a minute. Jesus encounters this guy named Levi, and one of the things that I'll warn you in advance, I'll probably mess up as we go through this, is Levi is one of those guys in the Bible that goes by two different names. We know him better as Matthew. So if you ever read Matthew's gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that's the same guy. But Luke introduces him by his Jewish name, which was Levi. And the reason that's important is that Levi, or Matthew, was not just some random dude. I mean, this is not just some guy in the story that kind of enters the story and then disappears quietly from the story. Instead, Matthew was a guy that was well known in that little area. He was part of one of the most corrupt systems, government systems, the world has ever known. And because of that, he was hated. So he was the kind of guy, when everybody heard his name, they would immediately recognize his name and think to themselves, yeah, I hate that guy. And the reason he was so hated is because he was part of this system. And at this point in history, you have to remember, the Jewish people lived under kind of the iron fist of the Roman Empire. At the same time, the Roman Empire is continuing in their quest to conquer the world. And so they need this endless supply of money to fund their expansion. They've got to build roads. They've got to buy weapons. They've got to feed their army. And so what they did is they took their empire and they divided it up into all of these different geographical areas. And then they imposed this tax system in which they would hire somebody locally to collect the taxes in a given area. And people, they didn't just hire, people actually bid, like they would pay to have this job. They called it a tax franchise. And the reason people would spend their money to get this job was because the Romans, in their estimation, they thought people were kind of dumb, So they said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to set a tax rate at whatever percentage they wanted. And then if you had the rights to collect the taxes in that area, that tax district, you could come in and you could add to it whatever you wanted. And as long as the Romans got their percentage, if you were a tax collector, you were free to extort as much money on top of that as you wanted, and you could keep the surplus. And that's what Matthew did. So not only was Matthew working for the enemy, he was literally stealing from his own people. So to say that these guys were hated would be an understatement. There's a phrase that you'll see as you read through the New Testament. You'll see it often, and it goes like this. It says, tax collectors and sinners. Or sometimes you'll see it, sinners and tax collectors. And you read that and you think, well, that's kind of a strange way to say it because we're all sinners. But you have to remember, in the first century Jewish world, tax collectors were their own category. I mean, these guys were so bad. So you might say, I know I'm a sinner and I know I'm really bad, but at least I'm not a tax collector. I mean, those guys were like as low as you could go. That was the absolute bottom. And that's where Levi was. But it's not where he started. If you're familiar with the Old Testament, the Levi in our story had an ancestor that was also named Levi. And he was the third of Jacob's 12 sons who later became the 12 tribes of Israel. And Levi's descendants became known as the Levites. Now, the reason that's important, if you remember our study of Exodus a few weeks ago, you get to Exodus 32. Moses is up on the mountain. All the Jewish people are down there at the base of the mountain. And they're dancing around this golden calf, worshiping this calf. And there's only one tribe of people who didn't participate in that, and that was the Levites, the descendants of Levi. And so because of that, they become the spiritual leaders of the Jewish people, and that was Matthew's heritage. So from the day he was born, it was just assumed that at some point in the future, he would follow in his ancestors' footsteps, and he would eventually become a priest. But then, just like a lot of us, at some point, his life took a pretty dramatic wrong turn. And we don't know how it happened, not even sure when it happened, but what we do know is that he got off track. Instead of becoming a respected priest, he wound up a hated tax collector. And don't think that he didn't recognize the irony. One New Testament scholar explained it this way. He said, for any Jew to abandon his heritage to become a tax collector was bad. For a member of the tribe of Levi to do it was beyond comprehension. In a culture that was supremely religious, where seemingly every month played host to a different festival or a day of remembrance, his guilt followed him around like a shadow. Every time he wrote his name, he was reminded of what he'd become in contrast to who he was born to be. Now, you hear all that and you think, okay, I get that, but what does that have to do with us? And the answer is, it has everything to do with us. Because right now, we live in a world in which we are surrounded by people just like Matthew. And in fact, if we were forced to be honest, some of us would have to admit that we're a lot like Matthew. Like maybe when you were younger, you had big dreams of what your life was going to look like. Maybe even your parents talked about all the great things that you were sure to accomplish, but now you're a little older and you're starting to realize that the person you've become is not the person that you ever thought you would be. And maybe just like Matthew, you're continually running into this steady stream of reminders that your life has not turned out like you expected. And that's the world that Matthew lived in, and it's the world that a lot of us live in. And that brings us back to our question, what is the way forward? How do you be the church in that kind of environment? There are 3 timeless values that define the way forward. So if you're tracking with us, here's the first one. Moving forward will require an unwavering commitment. And we've talked about this several times throughout this series, so I don't want to belabor this point. But one of the things that strikes me about this scene is what happens next. Second part of verse 27. Here's what it says. After this, Jesus went out, and he saw a tax collector by the name of Levi sitting at his tax booth. Follow me, Jesus said to him. And Levi got up, left everything, and followed him. Now, you got to remember, Matthew's the kind of guy that never gets invited to anything because of his job. In fact, because tax collectors were considered ceremonially unclean by the Jewish law, he couldn't even go to church. I mean, it's bad if you can't go to church. And he never got invited to anything else, so his life was pretty lonely. I mean, it was a lonely existence. It wasn't all bad. I mean, he had lots of money, so his bank account was full, but his social calendar was always pretty empty. And so when Jesus comes along and says, hey, I'm going to invite you to be a part of this thing that I'm doing. I'm giving you a chance to experience something different, but first you have to leave all this behind. It's amazing how decisive Matthew is. It says, he got up, left everything, and followed. It's the exact same wording that Luke used to describe Peter's response earlier in the chapter. And one of the reasons that sort of captures our attention is because it is so different from what most of us do. I mean, here's what most of us do, or at least try to do. Rather than like leaving everything, and rather than turning our back on that old life and walking in a new direction, all that stuff we talk about, here's what we do. We like to try to combine parts of the old life with this new life that we're hoping to experience. And so we take the parts of the old life that we thought were working for us, and we try to eliminate maybe some of the parts that weren't working for us, and we've got this idea about what we want this new life to look like. So we take those two things and we try to force them together, and what we wind up doing is creating something that's not the old life and it's not the new life, but it's kind of this in-between life. You might call it a hybrid life. It's not one or the other. It's something completely different. And it's this mixture between the old and the new that over time proves to be incongruous because the pieces don't fit together. But yet that's what we like to do. And if you think about Levi's situation or Matthew's situation, I'm certain that was a temptation for him. I mean, put yourself in his position. Here he is, his job is secure. He's got this kind of government position. He's making a huge salary. He's got an opportunity to make even more money in the future as he climbs up the ladder. Behind him, there's a whole string of people that would kill to be in his position. And now Jesus comes along and says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to leave all of that behind and follow me. And Jesus does not give him a guarantee that the future is going to be any better than the past. And you can almost imagine Levi sitting there trying to negotiate some kind of deal, right? Because that's what we do. Okay, Jesus, I hear what you're saying. And I appreciate the offer. But how about this? How about I'll keep my position, I'll keep my salary and my benefits and my 401k and all of that. And then when I get off work every afternoon, if you need me for something, I'll be there. And if you need me like on the weekends for some kind of special deal, I'll be there. And at least 3 times, well, maybe 2 times a month, I'm going to come to church, so don't worry about that. And to make up for it, when I'm not there, I'm going to donate 10% of whatever we bring in that weekend, so you can use my money to fund whatever it is you're trying to do. I mean, to Matthew, that probably sounded like a great deal. It probably sounded like a generous deal, but that was not the deal that Jesus was offering. Jesus didn't offer a negotiated settlement. Instead, he asked him for a total commitment. You know, one of the problems that we face in our world today is that, let's just be honest, most of our churches are filled with people who in their own way have tried to work out some negotiated settlements with Jesus. So we willingly give up some things, but not everything. And if you read through Scripture and you read through church history, you'll discover that the churches that have impacted their communities the most were filled with people that said, we will do anything, we will go anywhere, and we will try to give whatever you ask us to give to be a part of what you're doing rather than what we're trying to do. Now here's a second thing you see in this story. As we move forward, the church is going to have to return to this idea of offering radical hospitality. Upon accepting Jesus' offer, Matthew immediately does something that should serve as a model for all of us who call ourselves followers of Jesus. Here's what it says in verse 29. Then Levi held a great banquet for Jesus at his house, and a large crowd of tax collectors and others were eating with him. So one of the things you see in the Gospels is that anytime somebody has this encounter with Jesus, the very first thing they do is they immediately start trying to introduce the people that are closest to them to Jesus. So sometimes it's a come and see kind of thing. Other times it's a more formal introduction. In this instance, Matthew decides to host this dinner party at his house in which Jesus is going to be the guest of honor. But what makes this so captivating is that not only does Matthew invite his new friend, he also invites all of his old friends who just happen to be tax collectors and sinners, because when you're a tax collector, your only friends are other tax collectors because everybody else hates you. So you have this kind of unexpected guest list. You've got Jesus at the top of the list. He's the guest of honor. And then around the table, you've got all these tax collectors and sinners and the people who never get invited to anything. They're kind of the outcast of respectable society. But those are Matthew's friends. And when you have a party, you invite your friends. So Matthew invites his old friends to meet his new friend, and everybody gets invited. But there's another group of people that's most likely on the guest list. They were most likely there that day. And that's the 4 disciples that we read about in the first part of this chapter. Remember, Peter, Andrew, James, and John. If you remember their story, they're there in Capernaum where all this is taking place. And they're all partners in this commercial fishing operation. Remember the story? Jesus unexpectedly shows up. He says, I want you to go back out. They go, they catch this massive catch of fish, which was money, like in their deal. And Jesus says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to take this massive catch of fish, this massive, influx of revenue, and I want you to leave it all behind and come and follow me. And the crazy thing is that they do. But now they're back in town, and Jesus has just invited the local tax collector, Matthew, to be a part of this same thing that he invited them to be a part of. And I'm sure that when they realized that, like when they learned that not only is Matthew going to be hanging out with us, but now we're supposed to go to Matthew's house and eat his food at his table, there's a part of them that had to have been a little bit hesitant. There had to have been a part of them that was increasingly uncomfortable with how this was going and where this was heading. I mean, here they are, four hardworking guys, small business owners, respected members of that little community. Not perfect, but they'd spent their lives trying their best to obey the law and pay their taxes and, try to do the right thing, to try to honor God's commands as best they could. And keep in mind, the whole time that they've been in business in that little fishing village, you know who it is that's been ripping them off year after year? Matthew. Every catch of fish, he's added a little bit more to pad his own pocket. Every time they go to pay their income tax and whatever they made, Matthew has his hand out to take just a little bit more. And now Jesus is inviting them to sit at the same table with a guy that's been stealing from them for as long as they can remember. Now, before you judge them for being a little bit hesitant, make sure you understand that had we been in their situation, we would have felt the same way. And the reason I know that's true is because that's what we do now. Just imagine, just think about how we sometimes feel, or how you sometimes feel when you realize that people who are different from you have been invited to sit at the same table that you're sitting at. Like, it's one thing, it's one thing if they cheer for a different team, or maybe they vote for a different party, but how do you react when somebody who's in the throes of an intense addiction shows up and sits on the same seat you're sitting on? Or what about when somebody who's just recently been caught in some public scandal shows up for the first time in a long time? What about when you look across the congregation and you recognize the face of someone whose picture you've just seen in the paper because of a recent arrest? How do you respond then? Are you hesitant? Or are you welcoming? Romans 5, the Apostle Paul said it like this. He said, "But God demonstrates His own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." Here's what he's saying. God did not cause you, He didn't say, like, clean up your act and then you'll get invited. No, He issues the invitation while we're still messed up. I love the way the writer Brennan Manning said this when he wrote, "Here is a revelation as bright as the evening star. Jesus comes for sinners, for those as outcast as tax collectors, and for those caught up in squalid choices and failed dreams. He comes for executives, street people, superstars, farmers, hookers, addicts, IRS agents, AIDS victims, and even used car salesmen. Jesus not only talks with these people, but dines with them, fully aware that His table fellowship with sinners will raise the eyebrows of religious bureaucrats who reject the gospel of grace." You go back and do an autopsy of churches that have died, you know what you'll discover? One of the leading causes of death is the inability to welcome people into the family who are different from them. And that brings us to the last thing you see in this passage. As we move forward, we need to go back to the beginning and adopt a posture of sustained humility. Now, predictably, as all of this is going on, the religious leaders, the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, they invite themselves to the party. And once they see who's there, once they see the guest list, they immediately begin to criticize and complain. To them, the idea of sitting around a table and sharing a meal with people who are not like them cuts against the grain of everything they think it means to follow God. And so, because they don't understand it, they immediately begin to criticize it. You see it in verse 30. It says, "But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law who belonged to their sect complained to His disciples, 'Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?'" One of the things you need to be prepared for, any church that decides that they're going to do what Jesus did, one of the things they have to prepare for is the inevitable criticism that will come. And unfortunately, most of the time that criticism will come from religious people or other religious people. So you'll hear things like, why are you always talking about inviting people to church? Why do we have to have so many community events, for those people? Why do y'all spend so much money on property and buildings? Why can't we go back to the way things used to be? Why do you emphasize children's ministry so much? Why do we open the doors to everybody? And you've heard some of those questions. Maybe you've even asked some of those same questions. But the answer to those questions is what Jesus said when you get to verse 31. Jesus answered them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." Now, this is one of those verses you've got to be really careful with, because the tendency, especially if you're a person who feels like things are going well, if you've been involved in the church for a long time, that the tendency is to assume that Jesus is saying that the goal of ministry is to reach people who are not like us and help them become more like us. But that's not it. Instead of saying there are two groups of people, what Jesus calls the sick and the healthy, what he's saying is that there's really only one group of people, and that's the sick, and we're all in it. I mean, even though the symptoms might be different from person to person, we've all been infected with the same disease, the disease of sin. And the only real difference is that some of us are too prideful to admit it, while others are humble enough to admit that we're sinners and we're in desperate need of a cure that we cannot manufacture on our own. See, in the future, the churches that are going to have the biggest impact on their communities are not the churches filled with people who are pretending to be righteous. That was the mistake of the religious leaders in Jesus' day. It's the mistake of a lot of religious people in our day. That's why nobody wanted to be around them, and that's why sometimes people don't want to be around us. Nobody wants to go to a church in which people pretend to have it all together. Instead, the churches that will have the biggest impact are the churches who are filled with people who know they're sick and they can't solve their own problem, and so they need Jesus. I have one last picture I want to show you. Back on August 1st, just 3 weeks ago, and just 48 hours after the closing of the last Bed Bath & Beyond brick and mortar location, the CEO of a company called Overstock.com announced that they had purchased the brand and they were relaunching Bed Bath & Beyond as an exclusively online company. So if now this company that was slow to react to the online shopping world is exclusively online. Some of you might want to write down the details. CNN announced the move with this headline: Bed Bath & Beyond is back from the dead. And in the article, the CEO explained how this new version of this company will operate with the values of the original Bed Bath & Beyond combined with the business savvy of Overstock.com. They're calling it a match made in retail heaven. And they've said they expect it to lead to a bigger and better beyond, whatever that means. Now, whether any of that works out or not, I don't know, but here's what I know for certain. The world around us has changed to the degree that it's hardly recognizable. And if those trends continue in the future, that change will only accelerate. Now, thankfully, as a church, we are far from dead. In fact, by almost every measurable category, we're doing better than we've done in a long, long time. But for that to continue, we have to live in what I call a state of perpetual resurrection. We have to continually allow ourselves to be resurrected and recreated so that we can reach people who are far from God. The stakes are too high. The mission is too important for us to lose sight of that and to slowly slide back into irrelevance and decline. But for us to get to where we believe God is calling us to go, it's going to require us to continually go back to the beginning, to reclaim these values that have always been a part of this thing that God is doing called the church: unwavering commitment, radical hospitality, and sustained humility. But to be honest, for some of you here this morning, what you need to be worried about is not so much perpetual resurrection as it is personal resurrection. So over the last few weeks, we've used these stories from Luke chapter 5 to explain what a church is supposed to look like and how it's been designed to function. But another way to read those stories, in each of those stories, you have these people who experience something with Jesus that they could never experience anywhere else with anybody else. They can never manufacture it on their own. And that may be where you are this morning. Maybe just like Matthew, you're here and all you really know is that you're ready for something different. You might not even be sure what that difference is going to look like and how it's all going to come together. But if that's your situation, I want you to know you can experience something different. You can experience something better, but it all starts with saying yes to Jesus. The problem is, most of the time, whenever Jesus calls, we either say no, or we say maybe, or we say someday. And maybe, no, and someday don't change anything. But yes changes everything. If you're here this morning and you're ready to say yes and ready to allow Jesus to move you from death to life, we'd love to help you. I want you to stand with us. We're going to sing a couple final songs. David's here, John's here, Austin's up here. If you want to pray with somebody, if you have questions about what this would look like, we'd love to talk with you. Just meet us on this front row.